Okay, as previously mentioned, the panel-led discussion is a tradition at MLHC, and before that, MUCMed. And for some reason, it's become a tradition that I, for some reason, have to moderate it every time. So we're sticking with that this year as well. Now, normally what that would mean is you'd be treated to some kind of long Dave Kale preamble where I wax poetic. We're going to dispense with that this year so that we can get back some time and make sure that we maximize our actual discussion time, because I want to dive into some really good topics and some difficult questions related to some of the things that were presented this afternoon. So the overall theme of today's panel is basically going to be about the role of industry in kind of advancing machine learning for healthcare, in research, in translation, and also in deployment, which we just saw a wonderful series of presentations about. And I kind of want to get at not just the role, but also sort of frictions that arise, challenges that we might encounter, difficult questions that we might need to wrestle with in navigating the relationship between academia and industry. And to help guide us through this discussion, we have a wonderful set of panelists who will reflect a variety of different points of view, and in some cases, multiple points of view. So it should be a great discussion. To accelerate this process, I'm just going to start here with Pilar. I'm going to allow each of you to just introduce yourself in turn. And if you feel so, and say whatever you want to about yourself, if you feel so inclined, as I mentioned in the email, if there's something top of mind that you think is like a challenge that's worth calling out that you'd like to see us discuss, please mention it now, and I'll make sure that we add that to the agenda. So without further ado.
Hi, I'm Pilar Ossorio, and you've heard from me earlier. So I'm a professor of law and bioethics at the University of Wisconsin. I also run a bioethics program at a UW-associated research institute. I run a lot of things, it feels like, including a research ethics consultation service that, among other things, helps our medical school develop policy. And so when you asked us about, what are some challenges? One of the challenges I see as somebody inside of an academic medical center is that our institution doesn't have anybody whose job it is to sort of make the data-related connections or the decisions about things like data sharing between our hospital, our medical school, and private entities. And so naturally what happened was department chairs came to me as the person who runs an ethics consultation service and said, we don't even know who at our own institution to talk to, and Google and Microsoft and many other organizations have been asking to buy our data or work with our data, and we don't know what's okay to do and what's not okay to do. So first of all, I was shocked that nowhere in my institution is there any policy related to this. And second of all, when I started talking to people from other universities, they also don't have policies in many, many, many cases. So, and I was talking to some people from companies, and they were saying, when we try to go to a university medical school to talk about, getting images from the radiology department, they can't even tell us who to talk to about that. Like, who has authority in a medical school or hospital to say it's okay to transfer these data out? So to me, that is a major barrier, that there are just these structural institutional deficits there. So we at UW are working on policy, and I know other organizations are starting to work on policy. I think some of you could play a role in helping to develop those policies.
Great, thanks. I'm Sachin Kheterpal. I'm a liver transplant anesthesiologist on Wednesdays and weekends, starting tomorrow morning, for example. The rest of the time, my background is as a software developer. So prior to my medical career, I was a software entrepreneur, started an electronic health record company, sold that to General Electric, and I was in corporate America for about 5 years. Got tired of PowerPoints, regulatory oversight, and meetings, so I came to academic medicine. Wait a second. So I'm dumb, first of all. And now at this point, with Jenna and one of our School of Public Health colleagues, I lead the university-wide Precision Health Initiative at the University of Michigan, and really try and bridge some of these issues that you've heard over the last day or two. I'll defer my challenge until we get through.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Luca Foschini. I'm the co-founder and chief data scientist of Evidation Health, a small company. You probably haven't heard from it, so I'm just going to tell you a few words about it. Our mission is that to measure health outcomes and disease progression in real-world settings, so outside the point of care. And in practice, this means running studies, most often in partnership with biopharma or even academic institution that use wearable sensors, smartphone, connected device to collect continuous data directly from the participants. One example of that means using phone interactions and keyboard interaction and voice biomarker to quantify cognitive impairment. And this is work that we just presented at KDD in collaboration with Apple and Eli Lilly, or use activity trackers to measure impairment that can come from multiple sclerosis or heart failure or even acute conditions such as flu. Company is 7 years old. We're hiring. That's shameless advertisement. So send me an email if you are a researcher in machine learning interested in industry positions. For challenges, I have one around alignment of incentives, but that's already on the books, so I'm not going to spend any more time.
I'm Katherine Heller. I'm at Duke University and Google.
Yeah. All right. So my name's Omar Badawi. I'm at Philips Healthcare, based in Baltimore. My original life was as a critical care pharmacist, and I also have a background in public health and epidemiology. And I joined what was a fairly mature startup company 15 years ago that was developing the eICU program, which is telemedicine for ICUs. And I've been working in research and development there for that time. And one of the things we've done back in 2008, we've took our aggregated data from our community of hospitals, which is several hundred hospitals at this point, and we de-identify and aggregate that data and set up a collaboration with our customers and academic partners for the EIC Research Institute. So we do collaborative research with that, and we brought some of the data for the Datathon that we had as the pre-event. So I manage that, and that's a big part of my job today, and as well as designing our decision support algorithms and things. So one of the things that I'd like to bring up as a challenge in designing models, I see a lot of the presentations and research is trying to solve very difficult problems where there's a lot of ambiguity around what's the right diagnosis or decision. And what I find extremely challenging to think about is how do you manage it's easy to figure out how to manage when clinicians agree with the algorithm. And those are sort of easy things. But what happens when there's a disagreement? And we know that clinicians are fallible, and we know the models are fallible. And so if you always take the clinician side when there's a disagreement, you're really minimizing the potential value. And if you always take the computer's side, then you're introducing unnecessary risk when it can be clearly wrong. So how do we figure out in that gray zone what's the best approach to take in those nuanced situations for patients?
Good question. All right, so let's see. I think I wrote that down. I'm going to put a pin on that. I think I want to return to this question around data sharing, which is sort of I feel like we were talking about this at MuckMed like 8 years ago. But I think the reason I thought that would be a good topic to start with, or the reason it seems interesting to me, is you just mentioned, Pilar, all these challenges that you've run into at Wisconsin. I know there have been some recent high-profile cases of sort of weirdness with industry getting access to hospital data. I'm not going to mention any specific company names. Everyone in here knows who they are. Right. And yet, 2 days ago, we had a datathon where a whole bunch of people came in and accessed a whole bunch of data. So there's this weird ambiguity. It's like, is sharing data hard or is it not hard? And when and why might it be hard? When is there ambiguity? Or when are there cases where it's actually really confusing and nobody knows what to do? And when are there cases where you can easily aggregate data from multiple hospital centers and then make it accessible on Google Cloud and let a bunch of people who show up to a datathon access it? So anybody want to volunteer to dive into this question right off the bat? Oh, yeah, there we go.
So in addition to my geek role, somehow I've had a policy role in this space as well. Michigan has my academic role is where we aggregate data from. We're up to about 50, 60 hospitals, 11 million patient records for perioperative medicine. But we don't sell that data and we don't give access of that data to industry. That's an assumption we had made, probably wasn't valid 10 years ago when we started the group. We've got data use agreements in place with each organization, academic organization, that says we can't do that explicitly. At University of Michigan, we've taken that one step further to state that we have a data and biospecimen policy committee, actually, co-chaired by our Chief of Regulatory Affairs and Office of Research. And it's staffed by bioethicists, lawyers, Office of Tech Transfer, computer geeks like me, and a broad range of perspectives. And we've held to a very specific guideline that if the patient would not ostensibly be aware that industry was accessing their data, we cannot give access to that data at the individual level. We go beyond HIPAA, we go beyond IRB, we go beyond OHRP. So these words of de-identified, which are let's be honest, false in 2019. No such thing. It's all re-identifiable if you try hard enough. If it's an individual level data or a chunk of a person, that chunk cannot be transferred to industry unless that patient has explicitly consented and used the word industry in their consent, not on page 14 of a 16-page consent, on the first page. So the 58,000 patients that you accessed, whose data you accessed on Thursday, was the Michigan Genomics Initiative, which we started about 6 years ago. Those patients explicitly consented to the use of their data by industry. When we know which industry partner is going to get it, for example, we're doing a cohort study with Apple. We've got 5,000 patients in that study. Those 5,000 patients know Apple is getting their data in a limited data set way. And as a faculty, I get a lot of blowback from my colleagues who say, but there's this really important science I have to partner on, or this is a lot of money they're willing to give me if I can just say that it meets HIPAA, meets IRB, I have all these other checkboxes. I think the culture of, because we called it a limited data set, that we can allow people to transfer that data is probably not going to be valid a few years from now, and we'll see a change in this area. I'll stop there.
Just so you know, the way I like panels to run is I participate as little as possible. So if anybody wants to just dive in, keep the conversation going, by all means, go.
So maybe just to be a little bit devil's advocate here. So the tone of, and full disclosure, right? I'm from industry, but my background is as a clinical pharmacist. And those of you know who clinical pharmacists, it's sort of in our genetics to be adversaries with pharma and industry. So I've always had a little, schizophrenia there. But looking at what you just spoke about, it has this implied tone that if industry is working with the data, it inherently has potentially nefarious purposes, where I would argue potentially that a lot of the innovation coming out of Michigan research may turn into industry and have the same motives and direction. So how do you make that distinction?
I completely agree with you that is an inaccurate assumption that we make. Having been in industry actually half of my career, and now the majority of my funding comes from industry, actually. I think it's not about what industry is going to do with it. I think those same nefarious behaviors are occurring in academia. I think the question is, what is that patient perceiving when they come to your hospital? Are they coming to their hospital thinking that their data or their biospecimen is going to be in industry's hands? When they come to a university of blank, we have a consent process that says you're at a research university, we're going to do use your data and biospecimens for a variety of purposes. In 2019, and that's why this changes. You can be right one decade and wrong another decade, and I'll be wrong a decade. I'll be wrong probably tomorrow, but I'll definitely be wrong a decade from now when those perceptions and contexts change. We don't believe that patients perceive when they come to a hospital to receive care that naturally that data would be flowing to another industry partner. Many of them want it to. We just want to ask them, and we want to create a model where it is easy for them to. I want to. My parents wanted to, which is why our data is in that data set. So when we talk about, this is friends and family, so we completely agree industry is essential to making progress, but I don't think that's what a participant would expect when they show up to a hospital.
And if I really want to agree with this, right, that this is not, people come to your hospital not to be a participant in research, but to receive care. And they often don't feel like they have a choice, and maybe depending on who the payer is for their healthcare, they might not have a choice of coming to your hospital or coming to particular units in your hospital that are making decisions about whether or not to share data. And this is one of the reasons we've been reluctant, is because if you look at empirical data on what patients expect and what they want, and frankly, even what explicit research participants expect and want, there is more reluctance to share data into the commercial sector. And I don't think it's necessarily because people think something nefarious will be done with it exactly. I think part of it is that they sort of feel like, well, if someone's going to make money off of this and I'm not, that seems inappropriate. So, okay, maybe we need to have a conversation with people about how does medical benefit actually happen in a society where product development is done in the private sector. But I think it's partly from knowing what, in the few empirical studies, knowing what people think and say. For instance, Lucila Ono Machado has a paper where they built a website and let people go on and specify how their medical data could be shared. And sharing to commercial partners was like the lowest, right? That was the thing people were most reluctant to do. And so that makes us then reluctant to just say, well, we think it's okay for us to decide on their behalf that it could be shared.
Yeah, something too? No. So you were getting?
Yeah, no, I do have something to say, but you go first.
Oh, okay, thanks.
It's the most polite panel ever.
Appreciate that. Thank you. I wanted to, I've been reflecting a lot about this, coming from the world of computer science, of a PhD in CS, and observational data is what it plops in your machine. You don't even think that at some point it was collected. You just analyze it, right? And then shifted into clinical research, in which there's this process of consent that's really ingrained in everybody's mind, and it's 10 pages of every single thing that this data is going to be used for, and to make sure that people actually understand it, there's actually a quiz at the end, right? There's a comprehension quiz. It's like, not only you read it, you really understand it. That's a big change. And I'm like, well, the data that we collect in our clinical study goes through this scrutiny for consent and understanding that has never been applied to all the data sets that I worked on when I was a computer scientist. And I resonate a lot with Sachin when he says, well, maybe things are changing. 5 years from now, we might be looking back and say, hey, these analyses that are done in observational data sets with unclear consent maybe just was not the right thing to do at that time. One quick comment to conclude that. 2 weeks ago, there was there's Sage Assembly. It's an open science gathering in Seattle hosted by Sage Bionetworks. And there was a really nice quote, a concept there that was introduced that struck my attention. That's called the concept of data visit. It's not that you use my data, but you come and visit my data. So when you visit me at my home, you need to go by my rules, and you have to be aware that that piece of data still I own it, and I'm watching you using in a way. And this was by the founder of FAIR, Moen Barents. So I think maybe thinking more about data visit instead of data use immediately gives you this idea of, yeah, of course, like intention is important and needs to be considered as the most important thing.
So I'm going to go with I actually think this mentality is a huge problem, right? Like, I think, to me, the most important thing is making medical progress to help people who have really bad diseases. And secondary to that is satisfying the perception of people who, like, think something is going to happen with their data. I don't think bad things happening with your data are good in any way whatsoever. And, like, I would never, ever condone anything but absolute regulation of that. But I think that all the time, routinely in society, as Luca said, now we do things like, I mean, Google will scan your email for ads, right? Like, I don't think using your email, writing an email, you thought in any way that you were, like, giving consent to that happening for ad purposes, right? And so, like, I agree with the consent process, right? But, like, I don't agree that we should hold up innovation in the healthcare space in order to really, what it is, like, make people happy, right? And so the idea that you can come forward with something that ends up on the front page of the New York Times, you know, that's frightening, but, like, you know, not necessarily enough that I wouldn't want to do healthcare research.
I guess I would ask, why is there a tension there between innovation and individual agency? Because I don't think this is about happiness, because we got miserable people signing those consents. That, you know, it's about the reason you're willing to give your privacy away is the convenience you receive personally. I use Gmail, and my life is easier because of it. I have chosen to give away my privacy, and that's a choice I made. And I think the concept of agency, particularly in healthcare in a field, you know, I'm guilty as charged. I'm a doctor, paternalistic. We used to tell patients, this is what you should do. So we have, by no means, healthcare has any right to stand and say that we are the purveyors of the right way to treat an individual. We are complicit in errors historically. But in our process, so that data set that was used on Thursday, we ask every single patient who comes to our operating rooms, and now we're asking patients in our clinics as well. 75% of them say yes. But we should be asking them, and if anything, I'll be honest, you're absolutely right, the research consent process is held up to a higher standard than we actually hold our clinical consent process. And that's embarrassing to me as a clinician. We will do things to a patient without really giving them a choice. We're going to go ahead and take you to an operation, and I'm going to do a general anesthetic. And we don't tell them the 8 things afterward. So we've got a lot to learn, but there's not a tension between doing good and doing right. You can actually do good the right way. It's always harder. It always takes more people, it always takes more resources, but we shouldn't somehow think that medical innovation needs to be quicker or less resource intensive. We should give people agency and the right to choose.
Okay, so I guess I'll ask you about, say, something like outside of a hospital setting, right? So say, like, take, say, like, search data at some tech company or whatever, right? That set of people was not consented to have that information used for healthcare purposes, right? Now, you could start consenting those people, right? It would take you a long time to get potentially a significant amount of data. You're missing the time interval in between what data you have collected and now. And it's not clear that consent rates are going to be necessarily as high, it depends how you phrase it, right? Necessarily as high as going into surgery. What I've seen is that when people are sick, people are very happy to give their data away, right? Like, I'm sick, if this could help anybody in my situation, if there's even a remote chance, I'm really happy for you to use my data, and I really don't care about data privacy at all. If somebody is not sick and it's going to help somebody who has some other illness, right? It's not so clear. Like, they're like, well, I don't know, somebody could come after me and I'm not sick. So I think there's a question of, like, how do you also explain to healthy people the benefit to sick people in a way that they understand, in a way that supersedes, like, their tendency to want to keep their data private because of their own self-centered concerns.
But so I think we all have self-centered concerns, right? And the point is that when you have a very serious or chronic illness, then your trade-offs are different, right? Because how you could benefit by the use of your data, or people very much like you, maybe your kids could benefit by, or your family members could benefit from the use of your data, that is actually very great at that moment when you're making the decision. So, I mean, that's also a self-centered way of thinking, right? So I think it's self-centered either way, and we should accept that. But the other thing I want to say is that, health is a really important value, but it's not the only important value. And you were using the examples of we basically have been surveilling people's Gmail and so forth and using that information. So the Annenberg School in 2016 did a study where they asked people, do you perceive that you are making an informed trade-off of trading away your privacy for benefits that you get on the internet? And that's not how people understood it at all, right? People understood it as things like Facebook have become so integral and central to life that I cannot live a full life without it. And I feel extremely coerced and disempowered because I feel like I don't have a choice, especially people whose business somehow used Facebook or Gmail felt like they didn't have a choice in using it, but they felt extremely disempowered and disrespected. And, that's not, I frankly think it's not a good way for anybody in society to interact with people, but particularly the healthcare system, right? Where people come to you and they are vulnerable and they can't, maybe you could live, I live my life without Facebook, and I live my life without Gmail too, by the way. But, no, really.
Intervention.
But I feel like I cannot actually do without some degree of healthcare, right?
Yeah, no, that's correct. I feel like, okay, so I agree that everybody acts in a self-centered way, right? But I think there's a value judgment on my part that the self-centeredness of somebody who has a chronic disease and the promise of being able to potentially make their lives better is more significant than somebody's unfounded concern about privacy. Not even their founded concern about privacy, but somebody's unfounded concern about privacy, which is potentially significant in our society, right? It's a lot, and it's a lot of people. If all those people would withhold their data, it would definitely impact a sick person.
Luca?
Yeah. Maybe one thought is, if we try to set ethics aside for a second, which is never the right thing to do, but let's just, just do this mental experiment, and we make a purely utilitarian argument on what is the cost of a data breach? How wrong can go things that people are so worried about? I mean, disclose a PHI, what happens? What really happens? And we try somehow to quantify that, and we weighed it against what is the loss in medical progress, which probably is hard to quantify, but maybe we can put a weight on that. I feel like a lot of people reason on this framework, and I'm not sure that's the right way to go. It could be a false dichotomy, because really the question you should ask is, how much resource do I need to invest to reconsent people? That's usually just taken off the table. So it's no, it's impossible, the rates are gonna be too low, we also lost the records, so they're never gonna say yes. But at Evidation specifically, we run also a consumer-facing platform, and we really went from, try to use data that was already collected with broad consent a priori to actually reconsent people even for diverse use. Yes, we had to put in place an infrastructure to allow that to happen, but it did work, and the rates are really high. So maybe there is a chance to do the right thing and not hinder progress for too long.
And think about that engaged community. You've got by the process of consenting, you actually need more data. Let's be honest. The biggest problem here is not algorithms, it's not CPUs, it's not GPUs, it's well-tagged data. So when you're looking at the MS project, getting someone to actually answer a question every day, is today a good day or a bad day? In an unconsented world, they're not going to answer that because you can't ask them that question. In a consented world, you create the potential for advancing science much more meaningfully because you've got a community of people with you. They're actually bought into the concept, wait, medical science needs me to advance as opposed to medical science needs my data. Subtle difference, but that effort, I completely agree with you, Luca, generates potentially what we're actually missing in machine learning, which is the tagged features of the outcomes. We got features ad nauseum. We just don't know what actually happens to people in the end.
I think Jim Fackler would like to make a comment from the audience.
What was the clue?
He's been staying there for 40 minutes.
So we've actually made it almost 3 full days without bringing the IRB up, but I'm on our IRB. And one of the challenges that we've got is, yes, and the IRB is to protect the patient, it's to protect the institution, but we also can't approve anything where the results of the analytics won't be right, won't yield a legitimate result. And one of the challenges is, now having learned that 25% of the people who were approached for the data we used on Thursday said no. You know, you have to wonder what the biases are, what the ethnic or racial biases are in the people who chose not to consent, and whether we're going to end up doing melanoma analytics on white people, and then you go into a group of blacks where it won't work because they didn't trust the system and wouldn't sign for consent. So, and I think we should be approaching this as the data as a public good, and we should be waiving consent far more than we currently do. Go ahead, tackle that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge problem. The bias introduced from missing data under this paradigm, and I believe that, one, we can take into account and really protect patient privacy and do good science, but not necessarily fully need consent in every type of analysis and data aggregation. And so you can make sure their concerns are addressed, but not have to physically go through consent each time. And
I'm not saying people shouldn't be told. I'm just saying, and people need to be informed. They need to come in, they need to know that the data will be used for good and not for nefariousness, regardless of whether it's academic nefariousness or industrial nefariousness. But once informed, the public health is a big deal, and these analytics are going to be a big deal. And if we're going to use, if we're going to use the microscopy to create an algorithm to pick up cervical cancer, you need everybody involved, or we're going to get bad results. And even the people who have signed the consent forms are going to get results that are bad.
Yeah, just like one more thing. One of the things that I recall that really struck me as a problem years ago, we were talking with a big company that was making clinical data repository out of medical record information, and patients would be able to control access to the data. And they were adding in features that would allow patients to say, yes, you can use this for research, but they could also hide certain parts of their medical record that might be used for research. And the thing that comes to my mind is, imagine if everybody with mental health issues or HIV decide to hide that, then all the research you're doing on that data set, you're completely blind to that issue being there, and you're going to make tools that potentially could be very harmful to that population because you're unaware of what really is happening with them because you don't have that data and it's just hidden.
That's a tricky point. I actually would be perfectly happy to just go on talking about consent for the rest of the panel, because I think this is actually kind of a fantastic topic that, you know, has connections to other conversations that are happening in society right now. I wonder if maybe if anybody would like to make a concluding comment, maybe you, Pilar, about how we can kind of think constructively about this topic. What I loved about this conversation is I feel like when this conversation's happened at this meeting before, it's usually like, it's about like sort of, you know, administrative questions around, you know, like, how do you convince your IRB to blah, blah, blah? How do you write your DUA, which is like an exhausting conversation. I love this because we were really just like taught, like we got to the crux of the issue, which is, should we be getting consent or not? And what are the implications? But I'm wondering, like, what are ways we can think constructively about this as a community and make progress on it and not talk ourselves in circles? And then we can move on to the next topic, which is going to be incentives. Yeah.
So I could say that there are different models in use, right? So this idea that you want as complete a data set as possible. So Vanderbilt's BioVU, they use an opt-out model where basically everybody who gets healthcare in their system is, their data are so-called de-identified, put into a repository, and if they have certain medical procedures done, a biospecimen is also saved. They can opt out. And very few people do, and it turns out probably very few people really know that they can, but they're supposed to get notice that this is happening, and then they have procedures to opt out. So it's setting a default in a way that you assume that most people would say yes, and that this is enough it honors their autonomy and their choice and their need for a choice enough, right? So that model has been heavily criticized, but it's being used, right? And it does give people who really, really care and really don't want to be participants a way to pull themselves out. And a lot of other people, frankly, maybe the degree of their concern is moderate. So that's one model. Another model is just to give notice and no option to opt out. And then we have the much more robust consent model. I guess the last thing I would say is that I don't think consent is just about people wanting to protect themselves from bad things happening, right? Choice matters to people, and feeling like you have agency matters to people, and I think especially in relationship to your interactions with your healthcare system, which can be very daunting and kind of a little dehumanizing. Choice matters, right? And so one of the things we see in situations where people have reconsented and then they've studied the people both who gave consent and didn't consent, even in situations where very high proportions of people reconsented for data sharing and they said yes, most of those same people also said, it really mattered to me that I was asked. And it wasn't that I was concerned that horrible things were going to happen to my data. I trust you enough to use adequate security and so forth. But it matters to me to be asked and to have that sense of agency. So I want to leave us with the idea that this consent conversation is not just about privacy and data security. It's also about people having a sense of agency.
Thank you. That's a good final note. Luca, do you want to kick off the question of incentives and aligning incentives and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so there hasn't been a question, but I think the question is there alignment of incentive in healthcare? And I think it's a kind of a moot question because the answer obviously no. There's not, and usually they show.
You want to clarify for those of us who are like less savvy in the room, or like, oh, I hadn't really thought about that. Like, sort of give us a little more detail on which incentives you think in particular might be misaligned and why and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that one that we see constantly on the news is payers and providers, at least in the United States. So payers are insurance company, that's the technical name. The cost of healthcare is ballooning. No one is really interested in pushing it down. And that comes from the fact that providers have interest in charging the payers more, and the payers has no interest in changing the status quo directly. The point I had myself is that it seems that there are many situations like that in healthcare in which there is kind of like all the players are in a sort of a natural equilibrium. Like if each of them moves by themselves, they're getting a worse off. So you need to partner and convince a subset of people to all move together. And the example for us, so we work a lot with pharma, so I'm more on the clinical side of things, is developing new measures to approve drugs. So new endpoints in which drugs are approved. No pharma company itself want to undertake that because that new measure that will make trials faster and more efficient then is being used by everybody else. So they will have to invest the cost of R&D for a return that then is of everyone. So no one will move first. But as soon as you create a consortium of pharma people and regulator, and that measure gets developed in a pre-competitive way, then everybody has interest in doing that, and like things move pretty quickly. So my thoughts or recommendation is We tend to see a lot like, oh, there's a misalignment of incentives, tough luck, right? I hope that the regulation will change, and I will wait until then. But maybe a better way is just like, who should I partner with to make sure that the group of people that I'm partnering with all together has an incentive in moving forward that's automatic.
Who else would like to dive in on this topic? Omar, I see you moving. Oh yeah, great. Let's hear it, man.
Great. So yeah, on the one hand, I think the idea of the public good view is compelling in a lot of ways. Like, in some ways, health, is a public good. Like, should people have consent about opting out of vaccines? Whoa, that seems extreme. There are some, I think, corner cases that make me uncomfortable. But I also think that a lot of these questions are not anything near that level of intensity. And so I wonder, I guess it's a question for you about this board of bioethicists and lawyers. Is there a dedicated patient advocate, kind of like a public defender whose job is to speak for the patients, but also maybe just randomly survey and call patients and see, what do you think about this thing? I want to speak on your behalf. And just have someone whose one single role, that's the incentive hook, whose one single role is to be the patient advocate, as opposed to a researcher who cares about ethics or a lawyer who cares about getting sued or something.
So we have a patient and family-centered care group that we work with, and the problem is we haven't found how to get one single individual on the committee to reflect the community, because oftentimes what happens, the NIH has found this, is that we tend to have a individual and we use them as a token individual to reflect a couple million people, which doesn't always work as well as you might hope. So what we do is we actually take 10 people and use them to represent 1 million people instead, just like all of us do in our derivation and validation cohorts. And we found that way works a little bit better. So we work with our patient family-centered care group, who is essentially our conscience in that area. So because they are then connected to another 100, and that 100 are connected to a larger committee. And that is a bit more sustainable than a patient representative on that committee. But completely agree that a bunch of researchers, even though we get sick and have healthcare times, we're not reflective of the group we theoretically claim we are advocating for or serving.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say medicine also has a similar kind of patient engagement organization within the healthcare setting. So it's a whole panel of people and a way of having various community conversations so that you don't just have one person, actually. I want to go back to this incentives thing, though, because I thought that was lovely, and it's all about overcoming the collective action problem. And it seems to me this is where NIH also can play a role, and has in the past sometimes in like the genomics world played a role in bringing together pharmaceutical companies and academic researchers in the, quote, pre-competitive space, and also funding some of that work so that nobody feels like no private entity feels like they're the ones putting in all the money that everybody else is going to free ride on, the outcomes later. So I thought that was beautiful.
Anybody else have some thoughts? But before that, actually, maybe what I'll do is, as I'm watching the clock count down, I'll maybe expand the scope of the question a little bit and talk not necessarily so much, not focus or restrict the topic to incentives and thinking about alignment of incentives, but even problems. Like, what I'm curious about, or I guess what I'm really getting at is, are there any perceived gaps between sort of the interest of academic medicine and machine learning and as a specific subset of that, of the kinds of problems we're working on, the things we care about, the things that, the goals, the aims, et cetera, and then between that and the sort of work that folks that are in the industry, that are on the business side of healthcare, are interested in? Is there misalignment, maybe not necessarily in terms of incentives, but maybe in terms of problems that folks are working on, in terms of challenges that come up, that sort of thing? So, and I guess I'm really looking at the three of you at the end there, like, especially to the extent that each of you has like made kind of a little bit of a transition, had some experience of being on one side and also being on another side. And like, are there anything that surprised you once you start engaging with a private company that's interested in this space, where you're like, oh, I didn't realize that was something I never noticed or never cared about when I was purely on the academic side. Now I see this is a problem of interest once you think about healthcare as a business.
I mean, I would actually say that I think that healthcare was a business regardless of what environment I was in, right? Like when I was dealing with a hospital in an academic setting, it was the motivations at the end of the day were business motivations. And I am sure, though actually I've been told less directly at like a tech industry company, right, that the motivations are business motivations. I'm sure that's still there. So I think for everybody that I've worked with, regardless of whether it's in academia or an industry, and I think their strengths are potentially different, right? It's business at the end of the day, and then what they've said to me personally tends to be just focus on your research.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I also something you said earlier in your talk resonated well, which is about how researchers don't want to deal maybe with the emotional front end of the users and the implementation. I think that gets to the idea of how siloed things are and how people tend to be very myopic in their views of what their role is. And I think it's very common in academics to be motivated by the advancement of new novel methods, publishing, getting it out, but how that necessarily translates into practice and dealing with that insanity is too much for them to deal with, and that's for someone else, and they're just on to the next paper. And so there's not a lot of great follow-through when their motivation is to just keep developing new things, but not necessarily be in that world that takes it full circle.
Yeah, absolutely agree on that, and I would even say more that in science, maybe in tech in general, we have this belief that if there's something better is being presented, it ought to be adopted, it will be adopted. But in reality, the burden of communication is still on who develops the method. So really go into like doing this constantly evangelization in a way that, this things needs to be implemented is important. The other point that I wanted to make is that difference between the gap you're asking, the gap between academia and industry. I feel there's one that's big and that's natural, and maybe we don't have to try to solve it, we just have to observe it, which is academia feels is about more science, so generalizable principle. So we, for instance, see generalization across many data sets as being a value, is a surrogate for trust of a method. And industry, on the other hand, is more of an engineering problem. It's more like, is really overfitting a solution to your specific problem and make it work in your case. So I'm thinking of bridges. Like you build a bridge, you don't have a science of bridges. Like every bridge is very different from each other. Now you have a material science, but that's very very much high level, and doesn't go into the implementation piece. And I think Suchi in her talks also has like this division between engineering and science, which I think is a crucial one, and does not need to be resolved. Maybe that's just the way it is.
I think one interesting with the industry is that we somehow in academia paint industry with a single brush. And that's so not true, whether it's entrepreneurial industry, classic device industry that I was in at GE versus pharma. They've got their own cultures, their own paces. And the most exciting thing is that now as Amazon and Apple and others are coming to space, the pace of change that the tech industry expects, Google's coming, is just a factor, multiple factors different than our classic make a drug, phase 1 trial, phase 2 trial, 10 years later, I have a drug, it doesn't work. That entire iteration is like a month these days. And healthcare and doctors we are so not ready for the expectations that our patients have now that these entrants are coming in. So we've gotten pretty comfortable with the culture of, I think, a pharma or biotech industry and the other industry, and it's a wonderful change. It's spectacular. I think we have to embrace it because fundamentally we are not scientific. We go to med school, we do all these things, we claim we're scientific, but the evidence underlying half of my decisions on a clinical day are usually non-existent, and the rest is just preference. And we just need to admit that and admit that we have to have these new entrants completely rewrite, but I don't think any health system, including my own, is prepared for the shift that's coming and embracing it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you said something really important there, which is I think the change is going to be patient-driven. I think it's entirely going to be patient. It's not going to come from inside hospitals or inside any institution.
Could I? So I actually have a question about gaps, because I feel like there is some kind of gap. So at least from an academic perspective, the scientists I work with and the clinicians I work with feel as though they either have to be a full collaborator with industry, or the other option is we just sell our data and they walk away with it. And I feel like there should be some middle ground, right? Because I actually think it is very crucial that products tend to get developed by industry, and way, way better than they do in academia. So we need to get that data into industry. And at the same time, I worry that, the whole sell and just walk away with it model actually might not lead to very good products, because it might not lead to a deep enough knowledge of the context in which the data were generated, for instance. And at the same time, it is not going to be possible for, any particular healthcare system to have robust, full collaborations on all the things industry might be doing, right? And so I feel like there needs to be there's a gap there that somehow needs to be filled, but I'm not quite sure what it would be filled with. So I would love to hear any ideas, actually.
So, that was actually a big part of the motivation of us creating the EICU Collaborative Research Database. I've been working with that data for 15 years. I have a clinical background. I work with the software engineers that develop the tool. We work with the clinician users, I understand their workflows, and I understand how difficult it is to work with that data. And so we won't just, even within Philips, give the data to other groups in research and say, sure, go ahead and use it, because I know they can't use it correctly. It's just, there's too many things there. And so what we did is we tried to take an approach of crowdsourcing, where all the information shouldn't lie within me and my team, and it's too hard to scale us up. And so what we did is collaborate with MIT and the Lab of Computational Physiology that manages MIMIC. So they have experience with that. And then we took 200,000 patients, have made it publicly available through a data use agreement. Everything's obviously de-identified and certification and everything. But now there's a ecosystem for sharing knowledge on how to interpret the data. And we go around with these datathons around the world, educating data scientists and clinicians how to do this type of research, how to try to think about what the underlying data means, how it got there. All those things are very hard, but with hundreds and thousands of researchers around the world sharing methods, then you can start advancing and not have it just tied into one small group with the knowledge.
Anyone else have other ideas they'd like to volunteer on this question of facilitating good collaborations without having it to be either or, all in or sell it and see ya? Thoughts? I know you were doing a lot of this, Luca.
That's right, yeah. But I'm also looking at the timer.
Yeah, let's go ahead. I'm managing the
flashing
time. I'm managing the time.
Yeah, so we've had quite good success actually in just applying for federal grants. So DARPA, NSF, NIH, in collaboration with academic institution, and I do think they do realize that having a company building the product piece of it and having an academic partner doing the science piece of it is the best of both worlds, and it has worked very well for us. In fact, when you were showing that. The funding agency still does not recognize apps as a thing that should be funded. We haven't encountered the same thing, or maybe things have changed since it was 3 or 4 years ago that you had the MS mosaic, or even more.
Yeah, it was a couple of years ago for sure, and so things might have changed. But I was explicitly told that by program officers at like federal granting agencies. They're like, this is not research. We will not fund this. Like very, very straightforward.
So here's a trick maybe. Like we phrase the app as a data sensing piece. It's just like one other sensors, right? It allows the patient to input data, and so it's fundamentally just like the other sensors that you're paying for already. And also increases compliance because you can build a system of incentives in the app, and we have this, we've seen that this works in practice. So when next time you write a grant.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind.
No.
Cool. All right. Well, we're running out of time. Anybody have one last final comment they would like to make? Maybe a last piece of advice to share with young researchers in the crowd who are staring at a very exciting brand new world of a lot of, not just machine learning in healthcare, but a lot of companies entering the field who weren't previously participating. Vigorous startups that are slowly conquering the world, that sort of thing. Any last piece of advice for students who are thinking like, well, maybe I'll head in the industry direction or something? Anybody want to toss one out?
I'm hiring.
Yes, Luca's hiring.
The weather's always like this in Ann Arbor, 12 months out of the year.
Yeah, perfect.
I think we're all hiring.
Maybe there's a nice article for you to read, for all us to read when we get out of here. Chris Hogg, CCO of Propeller Health, is about digital health. Is digital health growing fast a good thing? And the answer is obviously no. But it really applies for anything tech and health. Like things in health are not fast. So be prepared, be strapped down for the long run. If you join a company, it's not going to be a unicorn in the next 2 years. It might take 2 PhDs to actually have something that works. It's just like, it's not like tech. So chill.
That's good advice. Chill. All right, let's thank our panelists.
Thank you so much.
And here comes Jenna with a few final words. I'm sure it'll be fast.
Thank you, everyone. That was a wonderful panel. Over the last 2 days, we've had wonderful invited talks and presentations. I've seen numerous conversations that look like the beginnings of collaborations, and I encourage you all to continue to work with one another and follow up with each other throughout the year. And I'd just like to announce that MLHC 2020 will be August 14th and 15th at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. So you should all save the date. So far we've thanked the program chairs, we've thanked the speakers, we've thanked the area chairs, we've thanked the reviewers, we've thanked the sponsors, we've thanked the presenters and the students who submitted research papers and clinical abstracts, but we have yet to thank our organizers. So would Jeff, Beatrice, Joan, and Jessica please come up to the stage? You're all crucial to making this happen. I can't thank you enough. And didn't they do a fabulous job? Thank you so much. It was really wonderful. And last but not least, thank you to all of you. See you at Duke. Thanks.